Welcome, good afternoon, bonjour. I'm going to be introducing our next speaker. A couple of housekeeping things first. At the conclusion of Jennifer's talk, you will be able to buy and have her sign copies of all of her books, including the one she's going to be talking about today, right behind you at the big red table, sponsored by Phoenix Books. The other thing is, it goes without saying that out of consideration for each other and our speakers, we ask that everyone keep their cell phones turned off during the presentation. So, thank you. Readers are often curious as to where writers get their ideas. Jennifer Haigh, in many cases, has drawn from her upbringing for her acclaimed short stories and novels. She was raised in the coal mining region of western Pennsylvania. Jennifer's debut novel, Mrs. Kimble, portrays the lives of three women who marry the same duplicitous man. The Chicago Tribune called the book beautiful, devastating, and complex. 2011's powerfully written Faith focuses on the family of a fictional Boston priest accused of sexual abuse. A New York Times review praised Jennifer as, quote, an expert natural storyteller. Jennifer's heritage is even more evident in her novel Baker Towers, set in the fictional coal mining community of Bakerton, Pennsylvania. New York Times critic Janet Maslin described the book as, quote, utterly entrancingly alive on the page. Today, Jennifer will read from her latest work, News from Heaven, a collection of linked stories featuring characters from Baker Towers. News from Heaven recently received the Massachusetts Book Award and the Penn New England Award in Fiction. Richard Russo, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Empire Falls, has said, quote, the characters in News from Heaven are so vividly drawn, the inner lives revealed so deftly, with such intelligence and sympathy, that fictional Bakerton, Pennsylvania takes on the additional weight of, say, Winesburg, Ohio. High praise indeed. In addition to such lavish praise, Jennifer's books have also earned the Penn Hemingway Award for debut fiction and the Penn LL Winship Award for outstanding book by a New England author. They've been published in 16 languages. As an aside, I can say that I have read each and every one of Jennifer's books. I guarantee that you will not be disappointed. They are each and every one very powerful. Please join me in thanking Jennifer for coming all the way from Boston to be with us today and extend a warm Burlington Book Festival welcome to Jennifer Haigh.
Sharon, thank you for that terrific introduction. I'm delighted to be here today to read from and talk to you about my latest book, News from Heaven. News from Heaven is my fifth book, but my first collection of short stories. The first four books were all novels. This book is, it's kind of a hybrid between short stories and a novel, actually, because the 10 stories in it are all connected by the same place. It's the fictionalized coal mining town in western Pennsylvania called Bakerton, where I set my second book, Baker Towers. So for those who know that earlier book, there's a lot in this collection of short stories that will be familiar. So I thought what I would do today is read to you a little bit and then talk a little bit about the story. And if we have time at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. So thank you all for coming. And this is a story from News from Heaven called Favorite Son. For a certain kind of teenager, a small town is a prison. For another kind, it is a stage. At 16, I was one of the prisoners. Bakerton High was, to me, the world itself, an arena where great events were decided, a theater only in the sense that Vietnam had been, to American generals, a theater of war. The actors were boys and girls who'd grown up alongside me, the athletes and beauty queens who'd blossomed early and fierce. I worked evenings and weekends at Keener's Diner, and on Friday nights after football games, they filled every booth. The girls I envied and the boys I crushed on, coupling and recoupling like square dancers. Having none of my own, I marveled at their inexplicable self-confidence, these playmates who'd finger-painted alongside me in kindergarten, now inhabiting new adult bodies with effortless aplomb. There was, in the school corridors, a protocol for making eye contact, for nodding and smiling and saying hello. Boys could get away with sullenness or lose themselves in rowdy horseplay, but girls were bound by certain conventions. Ignore them and you'd be viewed as a misfit. If you happened to be the principal's daughter, you'd be branded as stuck-up or worse. My own face and body, other faces and bodies, all that compulsory nodding and smiling, these so absorbed my attention that I didn't see what was happening around me outside the theater. Somehow I failed to notice that my hometown was starting to disappear. Bakerton was a company town, always had been. In my grandparents' day, the Baker Brothers Coal Company built hundreds of company houses, and the mines employed nearly every man in town. Things continued this way, more or less, throughout my childhood. Then, in the spring of my sophomore year, Baker 11 closed. Mined out was the expression used. It meant that no coal was left in the ground, at least none that could be gotten to easily. The 11 was Baker's largest mine, and suddenly 900 men were cashing unemployment checks, confidently at first. They'd seen slowdowns before, and their union had looked after them. They owned houses and trucks, snowmobiles and motorboats. Certainly they were better off than my own family. It said something about our town that the high school principal earned less than a coal miner did. But by autumn, the men had grown desperate. Their unemployment ran out, a sobering development. The fall was wet and windy. Leaves turned, leaves fell. Buck season opened, still does, on the Monday after Thanksgiving. In Bakerton, it is a holiday of sorts. School was closed for the day, and I reported to Keener's at 4 a.m. to serve eggs and sausages and countless cups of coffee to men in orange vests. Every table was full despite heavy competition, the annual pancake breakfasts at the AMVETS, the Elks, and the Moose. On opening day, the woods rang with gunshot. Deer were hit, dragged, and hefted into pickup trucks. Taxidermy shops did a brisk business, and enterprising freelancers competed for the overflow, advertising with homemade yard signs, deer processed, fast and cheap. The biggest kills were photographed for the Bakerton Herald. The Monday after opening day, the front page ran a jubilant headline, "New record for opening week." No one said, but everyone knew, that it was a question of simple mathematics. The 900 men who now had plenty of free time to hunt deer. At the center of the page, just above the fold, was a photo of Mitch Stanek in his backyard. Beside him, a massive 10-pointer, a magnificent male specimen, hung upside down from a tree. Even in the grainy photo, Mitch was handsome, his blonde hair shaggy, his cheeks smudged with two-day beard. A woman named Charlene Dodd had been sent to take his picture, and she'd flirted a little, asked him to take off his vest and cap. Mitch had a certain way of standing, head and shoulders back, left fist pressed to his upper thigh. He'd been photographed many times in this stance for the Bakerton Herald and for his high school yearbook some 15 years before. Back in Mitch's heyday, my father had advised the yearbook staff. In our basement was a full set of the banner dating to before I was born. As a teenager, I studied them like lost scriptures. I laughed at the outdated hairstyles, but really I was looking for wisdom, some secret to navigating a world where I felt misplaced, ridiculous, and shunned. Mitch Stanek was all over his yearbook, dressed usually in a numbered jersey. As a senior, he'd captained teams in football, basketball, and baseball. For Bakerton, it had been a winning season. 15 years later, the trophies were still on display, filling an entire glass case in school. He was going to set the world on fire, my mother said, looking over my shoulder as I read. Now he's out of work like everyone else. Mitch Stanek had been her student in sophomore English, a job she'd abandoned, as female teachers used to, when she had her own children. Now she spent her days nursing my brother Teddy, who had cystic fibrosis and was in and out of hospitals. When she spoke of school sports or those who watched or played them, a sourness crept into her voice. My father remembered Mitch differently. That kid now, he was something. He spoke softly, though we were alone in his car and my mother couldn't possibly hear. On Saturday mornings, Dad gave me driving lessons. The car's ashtray was always full, its radio set to the local AM station, which had broadcast Bakerton High football the night before. Each Friday night, he visited his mother in a nursing home 2 towns over. I imagined him kissing her goodbye at 5 minutes to 8, just before kickoff time. He was the sort of father who'd have attended every game and most of the practices if his own son were able to play. We sat idling in the high school parking lot, Dad lost in memory, my driving lesson temporarily forgotten. Mitch Stanek could have made it. He was the real deal, best thing ever to come out of Bakerton. My father was a gentle soul and meant nothing by it. I didn't point out that Bakerton had also produced me. When Mitch was first laid off, he put in his name at Beth Steel for a job that would also prove expendable, but at the time seemed as solid as the stuff the mills turned out. Beth Steel never called. This baffled him at first, when bad luck was new to him. "We'll wait it out," he told his wife. Unemployment would carry them through the summer. At the time, he believed what everyone believed, that his old job would return, that Baker would break ground on a new mine, bigger and better than the 11. His wife knew better. Dina, who stretched the unemployment checks to cover the mortgage, the car and boat payments, everything their 4 boys ate and played with and wore. She worked for a time, sweeping up hair at Ruth Rizzo Beauty, then got her own license and opened a salon in their basement. While Mitch waited for the phone to ring, she worked 6 days a week, shag cuts and highlights and permanent waves. This was the 80s, remember. But no hairdresser could earn what a miner had. By August, she'd had enough and sent him away. She got the idea from Cheryl Burks, whose husband had found a construction job in the Virginia suburbs. Lou Burks shared a cheap apartment with 2 other laid-off miners, and there was room for a 4th. Every weekend, the men piled into somebody's car and drove the 4 hours back to Pennsylvania, where their kids, at least, seemed happy to see them again. A temporary arrangement, Dina called it, but after a few months, Mitch began to wonder. He suggested moving the whole family to Virginia, but Dina seemed not to hear him. He knew the reason: the goddamn house. So every Friday night, exhausted, his back aching, he got behind the wheel and drove home to Bakerton, 200 miles north and west. Though his truck burned gas at a sickening rate, he allowed himself this one extravagance. After a week in the crowded apartment, he couldn't face sharing a ride with the guys. It was on one of these visits, the first Saturday in December, that Mitch snagged his 10-pointer. Afterward, he stopped at the vet's for a few beers to celebrate. "How many?" Dina demanded when he made his way home. 5, Mitch lied. He'd had twice that many, but beers were cheaper here than in Virginia, so he felt justified. Dina frowned. "What's the matter?" he demanded, smelling a fight and ready for it, but Dina didn't have time to argue. Mrs. Hauser, the principal's wife, was waiting in the basement, 10 minutes early for her perm. Mitch was livid, my mother reported later by phone to her friend, the school nurse. His move to Virginia had revived old gossip that Dina was ready to divorce him, that he'd hit her with a closed hand. It wasn't hard to picture. Mitch was a big man, Dina so petite she wore shoes from the girls' department. Even after 4 babies, she was tiny as a doll. Though no fan of Mitch Stanek, my mother called the rumors baseless. True, Dina was once seen with a bruise on her shoulder, but no one had to wear a sundress. No one would, my mother maintained, if she had something shameful to hide. My mother went to Dina's every Saturday for her wash and set. The beauty shop had its own entrance, so she never got a look at the rest of the house, a handsome split level on the outskirts of town. My mother admired it, though she allowed that it was bigger than any family needed, with a 3-car garage to hold Mitch's snowmobiles and as many bathrooms as children. She was not alone in this opinion. Most of Bakerton still lived in company houses, bought from the mines and disguised with porches and aluminum siding, but easy to spot by the familiar floor plan: 3 rooms upstairs, 3 rooms down. "Mitch thinks we should sell," Dina confessed as she rinsed my mother's hair at the sink. And sure enough, a few weeks later, the house was listed in the Herald at a price the town found insulting. No buyer could be found, which, according to my mother, was what Dina had intended. She wasn't about to lose that house. She came from poor people. We all did, I later learned, though at the time I thought we had rich and poor like any other place. Even by local standards, the Vances lived meanly in a duplex behind the gas company, a dark street loud with fuel trucks. Dina's mother worked in the dress factory, and the United Mine Workers sent her a monthly check from the Widows' Fund. With half as many children, she might have lived in reasonable comfort. Dina was the oldest of 6, a little beauty. As a girl, she resembled the actress Kim Novak, except that Kim dyed her hair and Dina was a natural blonde. She met Mitch her freshman year in high school. Mitch was a junior then, busy with his various sports. In the summers, he worked as a lifeguard. At the town swimming pool, in pairs or threes, girls in bikinis flocked around his chair, keeping him company during his shift. As they spoke, Mitch's eyes wandered, alert for swimmers in distress. He never showed the slightest interest in dating until Dina Vance. My mother and the school nurse, who followed student romances with an interest that now seems peculiar, shared in the general astonishment when Mitch took Dina to the winter ball. "For heaven's sake," my mother huffed, "why her?" The Staneks were a solid family, Mitch's father a lector in our church. Even now, when I read the letters of St. Paul, I hear them in Herc Stanek's gruff voice. Mitch was that rare thing in Bakerton, a boy with a future. When he played in the state basketball championships, scouts were spotted in the stands. In bars and barbershops, speculation was rampant. Basketball or football? Penn State or Pitt? The question wasn't whether he'd go to college, but simply which one. At Bakerton High, the matter was debated in the faculty lounge in a cloud of cigarette smoke. Like the crowd at a junior high dance, the teachers split along gender lines, women at the long tables near the window, men standing around the coffee machine. They spoke of many things, local affairs, movies, and politics, but were most animated when discussing their students. The men knew how far Mitch could throw a football. The women were more interested in Dina. "It won't last," my mother told the school nurse. "He's got bigger fish to fry." My mother was wrong. Mitch and Dina became inseparable. They walked hand in hand through the school corridors. In the summer, she rode with him to work. Girls no longer approached the lifeguard chair, not with Dina stretched out on a towel a few yards away, eyes closed, working on her tan. Every hour, Mitch took a break. To empty the pool, he blew 2 long blasts on his whistle. He approached Dina's towel and knelt at her feet. She was 15 years old, beautiful and naked but for 2 bright strips of nylon. Mitch Stanek was a giant fallen to his knees. "You wait," my mother told the school nurse. "Wait until school starts." By school, she meant football. The first home game was the first weekend in August, a sultry night, but the spectators wore shorts and tank tops. A few bare chests were painted in the team colors, black and gold like the Steelers. In that crowd, 2 men in suits were as conspicuous as drag queens. More scouts were spotted a week later, and again in October. In November, Mitch made his decision. Not Pitt or Penn State, but Florida State, a choice that blinded the town with its sheer exoticism. Could Mitch play in hot weather? And what about poor Dina? I imagine her grim face as they walked the halls of Bakerton High, Mitch stopping to receive hearty handshakes, the squeals of disbelief and delight. The Cattier girls congratulating Dina. Oh, you'll be down there every month to visit. Knowing she couldn't afford a bus ticket to Altoona, never mind plane fare. Florida State gave Mitch the hero treatment, flying his parents down to have a look at the campus, paying for their meals and airfare and Mitch's new clothes. The Herald ran a story on page 1 with a picture of Mitch in a jacket and tie. It was the first time he'd been photographed out of uniform. He left Bakerton just after graduation, in time for summer training camp. Herc drove him to the airport in Pittsburgh, with Dina riding along. Mitch's sister took a photo of his plane taking off. It was printed in the next week's newspaper beneath a bold headline. Stanek heads south. Town's favorite son marches on. Fall came. For 3 months of Saturdays, the town was glued to the television. Mitch sat out 2 games, but my father would remember it always, threw a touchdown in the 3rd. The elementary school classes wrote him letters of congratulation. Then Mitch came home at Thanksgiving and announced he was quitting school. Soon all of Bakerton had heard about the drugs down there, how his roommates smoked marijuana at night while Mitch was sleeping, how just breathing that smoke made him feel sick and crazy. In bars and barbershops, men debated Mitch's decision. The young ones called him foolish. Their fathers argued that you didn't mess with drugs. She's pregnant, my mother told the school nurse. Mark my words. Mitch got his union card by Christmas, but a full year passed before he and Dina married. Once again, my mother was wrong. I grew up and forgot these stories. I went away to college, and Bakerton receded from my imagination. At holidays, at school breaks, I came back to visit. Driving down Main Street was like visiting a beloved aunt in hospice, a breath away from the grave. Baker 9 had closed, and the 14 would soon follow. At Baker 6, the men worked 3 days a week. For sale signs appeared on lawns, in windows, but no one was buying. Families divided, as the Staneks had done. At Bakerton High, the classes were shrinking. My father took the early retirement the state offered, thankful for his pension, glad to get out while he could. At college, I worked and studied. I came back jaded and worldly from a junior year abroad. After graduation, I visited less frequently. My parents aged before my eyes, gradually and then rapidly. One year at Christmas, my father was shockingly gaunt. His dry cough had grown into something more ominous. He'd suffered through a hard month of treatment, but the prognosis was clear. For his benefit, we walked through the old rituals. Bing Crosby on the stereo, the tree hung with familiar ornaments, a popsicle stick angel my brother had made before he died. By Christmas Eve, my father was exhausted, his cough nearly constant. "The Lord will forgive me," he said. "You two go ahead." With a creeping dread, I dressed for midnight mass. I had been a college atheist. Now I lacked even that conviction. I hadn't been inside a church since Teddy's funeral. Under other circumstances, I would have declined politely, but that year, I didn't have the heart. The church was crowded. Families reunited for the holiday. We squeezed into a pew near the front. I recognized Mitch and Dina Stanek with their 4 sons, arranged in order of height, smallest to tallest, like a set of Russian dolls. From behind, Mitch still resembled a college athlete. his thick neck and broad shoulders, his blonde hair untouched by gray. I'd seen his truck parked behind the church, one of many with Virginia plates. Watching him, I was filled with an old longing I'd nearly forgotten, to be Mitch and Dina both, not now, but a lifetime ago, when they were beguiling and rare. I was thinking such thoughts when Father Veltri swept down the aisle, a stout little man in white holiday vestments. He stopped just ahead of me and leaned in to touch Mitch's shoulder, so close that I could smell his aftershave. "Merry Christmas, Mitchell," he whispered as they shook hands. "I have a favor to ask." He handed over a leather-bound book, the page marked with a red ribbon, Paul's epistle to Titus. I knew it almost by heart. "I'd be grateful if you could read this," said the priest, "in memory of your father. Herc would be proud." Mitch's face reddened. "I'm sorry, Father. I'm not much of a public speaker." "Oh, come on," said Dina. "Pop would want you to." I said no. Mitch's whisper was harsher somehow than if he'd shouted. Dina looked as stricken as I felt. Even then, in my secular phase, I couldn't imagine saying no to a priest. Father Veltri apparently couldn't imagine hearing it. "It isn't long," he told Mitch. "Just come to the lectern after I say the blessing. I appreciate it, Mitchell." He left the book in Mitch's hand and swept away in a rustle of satin, a plump little swan. A moment later, the Mass started. The aging choir warbled the opening hymn. Without a word to Dina, Mitch turned his back to the altar. Stone-faced, in front of God and everybody, he marched out of the church. I never saw Mitch Stanek again. That spring, my father lost his battle with lung cancer, and I went back to Bakerton for the funeral. The day was warm and spring-like. The snow nearly melted. I borrowed my mother's car and spent an afternoon on the country roads where Dad had taught me to drive. I saw then that the Stanek's house stood empty. They'd finally moved to Virginia, enrolled their boys in school there. A Century 21 sign was spiked into the front yard. That Christmas Eve, after church, my mother and I had ridden home in silence. The Mass had droned on for over an hour, but Mitch did not reappear. Dina had gone to the lectern in his place, her voice shaking a little on the first words. "Dearly beloved, the grace of God our Savior has appeared to all men." "He can't read," I said. My mother kept her eyes on the road. A light snow was falling, and her reflexes aren't what they used to be. Driving now requires her full attention, especially after dark. "That's why he dropped out of college," I said. "Drugs had nothing to do with it." Still, she didn't respond. "You were his teacher. Sophomore English, the Red Badge of Courage, the Scarlet Letter, books Mitch Stanek had been tested on. His comprehension had been judged adequate. He had been given a passing grade." Finally, my mother spoke. "He had a problem. A form of dyslexia, I believe. He was never diagnosed." With great care, she braked and signaled. "Times were different then, Rebecca. We didn't know about that sort of thing." "But he graduated. You let him." "It seemed best. I agonized over it at the time. Now I'm not sure it made any difference." I saw her point. Without a diploma, Mitch would have mined coal anyway, been laid off anyway. He'd have lost only those few months in Florida, his picture in the paper, the enduring legend the town still cherished. For Bakerton, it had been a net gain. For Mitch Stanek, the outcome would have been roughly the same. She pulled into the driveway and cut the headlights. "Ed doesn't know," she said. And I thought of the radio in his old Buick, my father listening to the games in secret, away from my mother's disdain, her caustic and sometimes merciless tongue. The local heroes, the Mitch Staneks, had been her favorite targets, but in the end, she was not merciless. She left my father his idols. Maybe she wanted Mitch to win, just like everyone else did. We sat a long moment in the dark car. The white flakes landed like news from heaven, notes from elsewhere fallen from the stars. Thank you. So that's a little taste of news from heaven. The writing process of this book was completely unlike that I experienced with my other books. Really, I backed into this one. It is, in a sense, the daughter of Baker Towers, my second book. For those who don't know it, Baker Towers is set in Bakerton. It opens in 1944 during the war years, and follows the rise and fall of this town as the coal mines are booming and later as they go bust. That book goes from about 1944 to around the time I was born in the Vietnam years. And after I'd written it, I thought that I'd said everything I had to say about that town. When I grew up there, my town was already on its last legs, and I grew up hearing these stories about what it was like there when the town was really vibrant, when the mines were booming and people lived there because they wanted to, and there were jobs and a real vibrant community life. By the time I came along, that was all just a memory, but the older people in my family still talked about it. So writing Baker Towers, for me, was my attempt to do some time travel and go back and see what it really was like back then. So after I'd done that, I thought, okay, done with Bakerton. And I went on to write a couple more novels set in Boston, where I live. But a couple years after I finished writing Baker Towers, a strange thing happened. I found myself wondering about a couple of the characters in that book. So what did they do then? Because implicitly, when you write a novel, the characters aren't all gone at the final word. That they're still living in this ether of your imagination and walking around and breathing and doing things. And so I thought, I'm going to write a short story just about this one character because I'm curious about her. And that one story led to another, led to another, led to another. And before I knew it, I had 10 of them, and they were all somehow related to Bakerton. Most of them take place there. A couple do not, but they involve characters who've left the town. It was just really a labor of love. I worked on these stories in between my other novels. I'd finish a draft of a novel and take a couple months and write a short story and then go back to the novel. So I wasn't intending to write a book, but I kind of ended up with one. I look at, I said News from Heaven is kind of the daughter of Baker Towers, and that's true. My relationship to this book is kind of like my relationship to friends whose parents I've met. When you meet somebody's mom and dad, you see them with entirely different eyes. You understand their DNA a little bit. And because I've written Baker Towers, I have this understanding of the DNA of this place. And in fact, a lot of the characters in News from Heaven are children or nieces and nephews or later generations of the same family as you saw in Baker Towers. Part of the reason I'm always drawn back to Bakerton as a subject is not just because I love the place and because it breaks my heart, but because it is a piece of the world that I often don't see reflected in fiction. I'm often struck by how contemporary fiction, literary fiction, completely ignores the existence of class. It does. And if you walk through any given bookstore and pick up a literary novel, it is much more likely to be about middle-class New Yorkers than coal miners in Appalachia. And I think this has to do with the kinds of people who actually write novels. Most of my writer friends in Boston and in New York come from very different backgrounds from mine. I write about a world that is recognizable to me, and my preoccupations as a writer are, of course, influenced by where I came from, as theirs are, I suppose. When I grew up there, my town was still mining. The nearest bookstore was 70 miles away. All my friends were the children of coal miners. And I can say this with some certainty. When I was growing up, I didn't know a single other kid whose family had a dictionary in the house. And it's a very telling thing. I grew up surrounded by books. My mother was a librarian, and my father was an English teacher. And the culture of my family was radically different from the culture around me. And I think if I'd had different parents, I'd be doing hair now. It has everything to do with my parents. I love talking about these books in a library because it would make my mother so happy. So I do feel that I'm one of a small handful of contemporary writers who are writing about the realities of working class people, and I'm glad that I have a voice to do that. When I go back to Bakerton, I'm struck by people's reaction to these books. By and large, they are very, very appreciative. And I know that when I was growing up in that town, I would have been stunned and delighted to see my world reflected anywhere in the culture, on television and movies and books. When I was a teenager especially, I felt like I was nobody from nowhere. And I think the kids growing up there still feel that way. And so I think people are surprised and touched that somebody thinks their lives are important enough to write a book about. So I found some of my most appreciative readers in that town. So I'm going to stop talking now, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody out there has one. Yeah.
I'm thinking that the setting and a lot of details of the culture are very much drawn from your own town that you grew up in. Mm-hmm. And are any of the characters, you don't have to name them, are any of the characters based on people you knew? I'm thinking maybe your parents, and it's transformed a bit.
Yes and no. They're all sort of composites of people I have known. So it's one of the great privileges of being a novelist. You can borrow with impunity. If there's a particular detail from somebody's life, you can use it, but you don't have to use the whole life. So I fashion these lives out of what I grew up seeing, and the people I saw around me. Often, people in my family or people who know me from back there recognize bits of themselves in the books, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong, honestly. Anytime somebody asks me, oh, is that character me? I always say yes. Yeah, that's you. But in fact, I've never written a single character that is a faithful iteration of somebody who lived. It's too limiting to be bound by reality. I'd be a journalist if I were that kind of writer, but I reserve the right to make stuff up. Yeah.
Obviously, as a writer, you're very prolific, and I was wondering if you could talk for a minute about your process and discipline in terms of writing on a daily basis or however you orchestrate your work.
Sure. I really think that, I had a teacher in grad school who said this very well. He used to say that being successful as a writer demanded talent and character, and talent is far more common than character. And I think that's true. I know lots of very talented writers who can never finish a book. And really, it's because nobody in the whole world cares if you do it. That is the real secret of writing novels. Even your own mother doesn't care if you do it. She'll pretend to, because she wants you to be happy, but she doesn't care. It's something you do entirely for yourself. The world is not waiting for your novels. You have to be the ultimate self-starter. And it's something that I'm fairly able to do because, unlike most people, I define happiness as sitting alone in a room. And if you don't, you're going to be very unhappy as a novelist. It is a very, very lonely life, and you have to love that. I often say that my life as a writer is like that old Bill Murray movie, Groundhog Day, where it's the same day over and over and over again. Luckily, it's a day I really like, so I'm perfectly happy with that, but it is, God knows, it is monotonous. I work every day. I get up very early. I go to a writing studio, not in my house, which for me is critically important. I've never been somebody who can write at home. And I work pretty much for as long as I can stand it. And some days that's not very long. Particularly when I'm starting a new novel, I only have an hour or two in me. And then I've written everything I know, and I have to leave and go do something else and wait for the bucket to fill up again the next day. As I get further into the project, I can work longer and longer days. Right now, I am working on a third draft of a new novel, and I can easily spend 8 hours in the studio. but I could not have done that 3 years ago when I was starting the book. So the workday expands as the work expands. Generally, I find revising a happier experience than writing a first draft. I think there are two kinds of writers, people who like writing the first draft and people who view that as a form of torture and really only like rewriting. And I'm the latter kind of writer. I really just like revising because that's where you get to see the work become good. You know, my first drafts are terrible, and I think most writers, if they're honest, would say the same thing. And it's very challenging to get up every day and face the mediocrity of the work I did yesterday. Because my first drafts, wow, I don't show them to anybody, and there's a reason. But the second draft I can sort of stand to look at, and by the third draft I can even kind of enjoy it. So, you know, the process gets less punishing as I get further in. It takes me about 3 years to finish a book, 2.5 to 3 years, depending. This book of short stories was a bit different because I did it in dribs and drabs. You know, I did a story here and a story there. But for a novel, once I start it, I'm very single-minded. I don't put it down to do anything else. I pretty much write it until I'm done writing it. And that has worked fairly well for me. Of course, the downside of that is when you're writing a novel and it falls apart in your hands, as has happened to me a couple times, then you've got nothing else. So, you know, it's the risk you take writing novels, and it's happened before, and it will probably happen to me again. So that's roughly what it looks like. It's Groundhog Day. Yeah.
Do you work on a computer or a typewriter or by hand?
I work by hand and on a computer. I often find it easier to do the very first draft by hand. It's less intimidating to me than looking at a blank computer screen. Typically what I do is write by hand until I've written myself out for that day, and then go to the computer that same day and sort of do a second draft of that work. So I'm working with the material I generated by hand, but in the process it's changing, I'm cutting things, I'm adding things, it expands. So I kind of do 2 drafts in one day, and then the next day start all over again working by hand. So it's always been a combination for me. There are certain things I can compose at the computer. If I do a book review, for example, I would write that at the computer, even sometimes a short story. But for some reason, novels, it's less daunting to me if I can just have a pen in my hand. You know, I've been doing that since I was 5 years old, writing by hand, and so it's comforting in a way. All right, then. Thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure to read for you.